Hey guys, welcome to the Dreadcutter podcast.
If you want to know how to blast your opponent down to zero authority, come check us out.
Woo!
Woo!
But yeah, so we're just gonna dive right into it. And topic number one is going to be relative choices, as in cards on the trade row relative to each other. And so we're kind of thinking like why would you buy a 3-cost card versus a 4-cost card? Why would you buy a 1 and a 3 versus a 4? Why would you buy a 5 versus a 4? Things like that. Comparing relative strength of cards and their trade costs.
Yeah, just from a beginner's standpoint,
Yeah.
what are we looking at?
So I kind of just want to talk about cards that are good buys pretty much no matter what, and cards that you want to sort of target. So scrapper cards, obviously quite good. Got a repair bot right here. Gives you 2 trade, potentially gives you a scrap in the discard pile. It's a nice card. It's a card worth getting. But a card that I think is significantly better, Probot. Woo! Yes, it's only 1 trade, but allies to give you a card draw and scraps in hand or discard pile. I think this card is a much better relative card than this card, right?
Yeah.
Probot, much better than Repairbot. So even though they both cost 2, they do different things. So same thing with like a patrol bot versus a probe bot. You could argue the merits of both of these cards. So patrol bot does 2 trade, 4 damage, but in order to scrap, it has to ally. So that's sort of its drawback. So this card's a little more versatile, right? Like it goes in other decks pretty good. If I need 2 trade, 4 damage, that's good. It's worth 2 trade. It's usually worth having. Whereas a pro bot is a little more specific. Like you want to kind of combo reds. You want to have the trade and the scrapping, excuse me. Whereas this card, if it doesn't scrap, it's not necessarily that bad. Like it does more stuff on its own. Whereas pro bot, maybe you want to combo more with other red cards. So I'd be more inclined to pick up Patrol Bot when I didn't have reds, but Pro Bot when I did have reds to try to trigger. But they both require allies. So if you can get them both together, obviously that's fantastic. And if you 4 trade on turn 2 or turn 1 or turn 2, snapping up both of these is really good. And, denying scrap to your opponent, also really good. Things like that. But if you have a card like Mining Mech, which is another scrap card, gives you 3 trade, scraps hand and discard pile, allies for 3 damage. This card's really good too, but is it better than getting both of these? I would argue no. This only gives you 1 scrap at a time. These could potentially give you 2 scraps if they come together. This one has a card draw on it. This one has more damage on it. Yes, you get less trade per card, but getting both of these together is 3 trade. This one card is 3 trade. And when you're cycling, you might draw these separately, but that's okay. I think their effects separately, having both of them in your deck is better than a mining mech. So that's what I mean when we talk about sort of the relative strength of cards is, am I giving up 2 cards when put together are better than the 1 card I'm about to buy?
Like when you get into the game a little more and you're really thinking about it from a standpoint of like, okay, how am I going to maximize the value of my buys every turn? And that's definitely something that you're going to think about. I think when you're a beginner, you have to think about like what is simply the power of a 2-cost card versus a 4-cost card, and relative, because we've gone through so many sets already of Star Realms that if you're already seeing all these new cards, like certain cards were made for certain types of decks, so like for example, like in the bases expansion, right, they were there to maximize bases, and so some of the effects of smaller cards or ships might be actually lessened because of those sets. And so that's why you see this relative jump in some 2-cost cards being a little less effective than maybe future sets, because they were trying to take that balance, of whatever the deck's theme was and actually balance the whole game out.
Yeah, they're trying to encourage you to utilize different strategies.
Yeah, so that's why you see that 2-cost that was the discard only pile, right? That is not going to be as effective as one that does multiple things like those other 2. And so, like, what I'm thinking as a beginner, if I was to think about like the beginning mindset, like I would simply say, like, first look at the numbers. Like, what are the 1 to 3s on the trade row? Here's a couple interesting ones that you can look at. There's there you go, cargo launch, which is a draw a card and scrap to get 1 trade, and then you have the swarmer, which is a really good card. It's scrap 1 and then 3 damage allies to create 2 more damage. And I would say, like, it really depends again, like, on the mindfulness. Like, what are you actually trying to build in your deck? Like, both of these ones have a different, like, effect. One's going to be more effective for a damage deck, right? An aggro deck. Whereas the other one is going to maximize your trade and your cycle values. It'll help you become more efficient. And so this is what we talk about when we're talking about mindfulness, especially as a beginner, is like, what effects allow me to do the thing I was intended to do. Like, if I wanted to just really kill my opponent, you would go for the swarmer because that gives you more damage. But if I want to get that big cost 6 to 8 card, then I want to go with, a cargo launch, because that's going to help me get that extra trade I need to get something like the Emperor's Dreadnought, or Death World, so just some of those things. You want to add something to that, Ryan? Yeah,
it's and this goes back to something we mentioned in the other podcast, is about like having a plan, and then that's also going to affect the relative value of each card that you buy. A card like Mech Cruiser here is, I think, a really, really good card, but it's weighted, it doesn't cycle. It does scrap. It scraps hand and discard, and it deals 6 damage, which is fantastic. But is this a card that you always want to add to your deck? I would say for the most part, yes. But you also got to kind of think, like, what deck am I building? Is my deck trying to draw a lot of cards and cycle a lot of cards? If that's the case, this card may not be as good because it does its effect, but then it sits there, it takes up a card slot. Mm-hmm. Whereas a card like Probot, for instance, because it has the ability to draw a card, could potentially be a card that doesn't take up a slot, that still has its effect. It still scraps. Yes, it doesn't do 6 damage, but being able to draw a card and then it also scraps itself, maybe this card is something that you'd want in your deck more than the Mech Cruiser, simply because that's what your deck is trying to do, and that's going to actually help you and give you more value outside of the damage. So it really depends, like how am I trying to win the game? If I'm just trying to blast my opponent in the face and go aggro, Mech Cruiser is much better. But if I'm trying to draw a lot of cards and try to make my deck really efficient and then kill my opponent in like 2 turns with a really efficient deck, a card like Probot might be a better choice. And buying Probot also potentially gives you 3 more trade to buy something else. And those 2 cards might be better than that 1 card.
Yeah, exactly. And so just on the line of Mech Cruiser, right? Like, I'm not surprised that we both pick that out of our deck because it's a pretty amazing card.
I do love it. I do think it's a great card.
But sometimes, like, if you're in a blue deck and you're trying to combo, like, so when it doesn't have a combo like with other reds, then it actually becomes more like a 4-cost card, like, and so, or a 3 even, you could argue, like, but if you had a blue deck and then you say you had a Patrol Cutter, which is the cousin of the cutter, basically. I
love all cutters.
Is that it does give you damage, but it also gives you trade. And then when it allies with your blue deck, you could argue that this could become like a 4-cost card, like a more valued card in a blue deck, basically. Whereas this is not going to be as effective. So you want to kind of think about those things when you're starting to think about buying like certain cards, like what's going to synergize my deck more, and perhaps what's not going to synergize my opponent's deck, because sometimes you might
so like a card that is a good card but might have what you would call anti-synergy is a card like Cargo Pod. It's 3 trade, which is nice. It is a blob, but it only does damage if it allies with another blob or you scrap it to get rid of it. And so, like, it's a good card, I mean, I'll pick it up most of the time, but its effect is mostly get trade and then get rid of it. And what I see a lot of beginners do is they'll hold on to a card like this way longer than they should. You know, this kind of card, it's meant to play it, buy a big thing, scrap it for 3 damage, and then, you know, essentially upgrade the card.
Like, it's not I wouldn't say it's an engine card. I think it's one of those like really nice supplement cards, you know, where it's like when you're building the skyscraper, you gotta have like those holding blocks in, you know.
It's a cinder block that we get rid of.
A cinder block that we get rid of once the foundation is set for your deck, you know?
It's like the mold that holds up the plaster, and then we get rid of the mold.
You know, it's the mold to the Empire State Building. You know? It'll grow up like, you know, however many like stories.
It's gonna be enormous eventually, right?
But it needs to have those like, you know, blob trade things, like, in order for it.
I don't think a blob is gonna be a good foundation for a building, but the metaphor's breaking down. This building's about to fall for some reason. Why? It's made out of blob material. It's like Jello, but it's alive. You know,
yeah, but yeah, you do everything, yeah.
But when I say anti-synergy, what I mean is, like, initially this card is going to get you to buy some big stuff, but as soon as you buy the big stuff, you need to get rid of cards like this.
Or otherwise it drops to like a 1 or 2 cost card that in your deck, you know, basically.
Right? Yeah, because this card gives me 3 trade, but potentially I could buy a 1 cost card and a 2 cost card that would give me 4 trade or 5 trade, and that's going to be better in my deck. The good news is this card scraps itself, so even if it does have anti-synergy in your deck, you can still get rid of it, which is nice, and I think is actually the strongest part of this card. But what ends up happening is these trade cards that you buy initially very quickly become bloat. They become weight in your deck that you don't need, and you need to get rid of them somehow. Like, they serve their purpose, and then they need to go.
First, you want to like look at the trade row and see what's there. Obviously, if there's not any of these 1 or 2 cost cards, you might want to consider, like, you know, getting a couple of even the foundation card could be Explorer. You know, Explorers are great foundation cards. You know, just for initial, just like the trade. You know, blob, and like, what are the 1 to 3 cost cards that could help synergize my deck at the beginning, early on, to build up an engine for me to get those 4, 5, 6, 7 cards that will eventually be the knockout blows that help win out the game. Because essentially your 4 to 7 cards, your 4 to 8 cards are going to be the people that help really synergize your deck and get you the wins that you need, you know. But how do you build up to that? You're going to have to buy 1 to 3 cost cards, you know, at some point, just to create that foundation, you know. But, you know, sometimes that's not available. But I think most of the time in wins that I had at least 1 or 2 solid 1 to 3 cost cards that were really building the early establishments of my civilization deck, you know. That's what I think about every game that I play. Is
like, it's like 7 Wonders now.
I feel like that every time I build a deck, it's like I'm building a civilization, basically, you know.
Yeah, right. You know, so let's talk about some really nice foundational cards here. Got some yellows for you.
Oh, how did you know?
How did I know you'd want to talk about these?
Good present.
Yeah, right. So first one I'm going to talk about right here is the Lancer. 4 damage, yellow card. Allies to target the opponent discards a card. And then if your opponent has a base, it deals 2 extra damage. I think this card is fantastic. 1, it only costs 2, so you can buy it whenever you want. It's a base killer, which is great. This 1 card kills their 1 base. Fantastic. It's very rare that you can get cards this cheap that can do something like that. It has that discard on there, so it synergizes really well with yellows. But being able to clear out your opponent's bases is going to be really good at all stages in the game. I think this card is fantastic. What do you think about the Lancer there, Pat?
No, absolutely. Like, any cards that are 1 to 3 that can, I mean, or even 1 to 2 that can give you that production like right away, those are almost automatic buys, you know. Like if I see a Lancer on the field, I'm going to more times than not take it, just because it's like, even if it doesn't synergize my deck, because it just has one great effect, it just kills the base, or it does this, like something like the trade pod, like would be an example. Like the trade pod is 2 costs, it gives you 3 trade, you know, and then synergizes to give you 2 little bit extra damage. But that card is just super. Like I want to create a term for that. I don't know what to call it, but it's like the super twos or something like that.
The super twos.
Like super twos, yeah, like that Lancer is the super two. The
Sure.
trade and
I got another one for you if you want. Here's another
also
favorite of mine. Imperial Smuggler. Whew.
That's one of my favorite super twos.
It's 3 damage. Awesome. Gives you a cycle, a draw card and a discard, and potentially gets you 2 more trade. So 3 damage, draw a card, discard a card, then potentially get a better card all in 1 card. How is this only 2? Like, that's insane. Yeah. The amount of value you get out of this card blows my mind. And so a card like this is a really, really good pickup. In the early game, it's a great pickup. In the late game, it doesn't matter. Like, this card is good all the time.
Definitely a foundational card, like the trade pod, you know, like that's the 3 cost card, you know. I mean, sorry, 2 cost card that gives you 3. This was one of my early favorites of all time, you know.
Especially in vanilla, it's very strong.
Vanilla, it's very strong. It just gives you 3 trade. Like what card, you know, card that is 2 or less gives you 3 trade, you know. So it's just stuff like that really you want when you're talking about your 1 to 3s. You want to maximize the value that those 1s and 3s, because those are the little bits that might make the difference between that 1 extra damage or that 1 heal that you might need to survive or whatever. Like, those are the cards that provide that little extra bit, you know. And so you want to make those like your engine at first. Now I wanted to talk about actually 4 to 6. Okay. And I want to give you some interesting, you know, cards that I really love. One of them is the Battle Screecher. Yeah. The Battle Screecher is this most fantastic effect. Like, talk about giving you a bang for your buck. It gives you 5 damage, and you get to scrap up to all the cards in the deck. And if you're playing Kamikaze like me, you're playing like a big deck. You want to trigger as many events and crazy shit that happens. This is like crack, basically, you know.
This is like crack card.
The crack addict. And it also gives you like the ultimate trade control of the deck, you know. So you can just take away all 3 to 5 cards that your opponent might want, and it forces them to really start changing what their deck is doing. And you want to manipulate their deck as much as possible. And this is a great card to do it. And it also combos for 2 trade, which is a nice little bonus.
Yeah, I like it too because it screws up your opponent's plans.
It does.
Right? Like, your opponent might be going, okay, you know what? I've got my 7 trade, 8 trade now. I'm going to get that Capital World, and that's going to win me the game. And then you're just like, see you later.
And then you have all 1 to 2 cards. And
and then they're just like, oh, fuck.
I'm not going to pick up a Skeef. Like, why are there 3 Skeefs on the field?
Yeah, like, what is that? Fuck is that gonna do for me? Like, nothing.
And then you pick up those 3 Skeefs, and then a Dreadnought comes out, and you're like, oh, damn it! Like,
son of a bitch! Like, oh.
Another fun 4-cost card is the Customs Frigate, and this is a really fantastic card because I love the fact that you can just top deck a 4 or less card ship. So this is like a recruiter, basically. You know, they should probably call it the recruiter.
The recruiter.
Because it you know, anything that is a really cool. I don't know how many times
because you can customize what you do with it, right?
You can custom like how many times that could be the swing turn, you know, as like you get this card and then suddenly you just grab, like, you know, a mining mech or a patrol cutter or war kite or whatever. Not only can you top deck it, and if you come with blue, you get 4 damage, but then you can scrap to draw it. Yeah. So basically, it recruits it and then it draws it. Like what kind of effect as you do that? So in the same like level as Screecher is for the blob deck, like this is a fantastic, very surprisingly versatile like card, you know, that you can have in the game. So like that's what I'm talking about. Is like when you have a 4 to 6 cost card, they have to do a very intermediate, substantial like effect. They have to be the engine for your deck, you know?
Yeah.
Like when you're grabbing those cards, this is going to be a centerpiece for my deck, you know? And And what are your thoughts on that 4 to 6, Ryan?
I agree. When when you're considering, especially when you start thinking about 5-cost and 6-cost cards, typically those are the cards that you're going to kind of build your deck around. You're like, okay, I'm going to try to get to this 5 and 6-cost card as fast as I possibly can, hit it over and over and over again, and that's how I'm going to win.
That's how
So
most people win the games,
yeah.
They're gonna grab those 4 to 6 cards, and they have enough 4 to 6 cards where they just keep on cycling it, and then that's the end. And it's more powerful than the 1, 7, or 8 that other opponent might have in their deck.
So we've talked about this before, but a card like Blob Alpha,
just
10 damage.
Just game changer right there.
Surprisingly underrated Blob Alpha.
I don't think it's underrated. It's a freaking 10, man.
You'd be surprised how many people just don't buy this card.
I buy it every
don't
time.
buy it. I'm like, this is all you need. Get this card, draw it 3 times, smash your opponent, game over, man. Kills 2 bases on its own.
There's a reason why they put 10. They didn't put any subtext on it. Okay?
I know, that's why there's nothing else on there. It's just a big red number, and that's it. But the reason I say this card is undervalued is because all you got to do is, if you got a Blob Alpha and some other cards that draw a lot, then that's all you need. That's all you need. And again, this is why something like an Imperial Smuggler is so good, because it gives you the opportunity to draw into your Blob Alphas. So in the beginning of the game, it's great because then you can trade up to get a Blob Alpha. But then later on in the game, if you have it, you play it, you draw the Blob Alpha, you throw away your stupid Scout, and now you got 10 damage that you would not have had. So
it's like 10 Vipers.
It's like 10 Vipers. It's 10 Vipers, guys. It's really good. And so that's sort of the point is when we talk about card relativity, is just what are your cards doing for the amount of money that you put into it? If I spend 6 trade, but I'm getting 10 damage in one card, that's huge value, because there's other 6-cost, 5-cost cards that do half as much damage. They have other effects usually, but being able to just do 10 damage in one card is so strong. And
it forces your opponent to change. It forces also your opponent to change their strategy, because now it's if that card had 2 other blobs with it, that's a deck itself,
Right.
You have that, and then 2 even like a Swarmer or a Warkite, or Warkite's another one of those bad boys that can just kill bases, but if you have 1 or 2 comboed with that's a deck itself, you just scrap down enough, and then boom, that's it.
There you go.
Game over.
Even if you're not scrapped, you're still getting 17 to 25 damage a turn, just because you have 3 to 4 blobs in your deck.
It's even if I didn't have a cycle, even if I didn't have scrap, that's why blob is so nice, because you can keep on getting blob cards, and then they will make up for the lack of efficiency you have in your deck, because you can just keep on drawing into damage basically. Let's talk about some of the 7-8 cards that we really like. And I think the thing about 7-8 cards, and I know you'll agree upon this, is that there's a choice you have to make at the beginning of the game, right? Where it's if I'm going to go for these 7-8 cards, there's actually a sacrifice that I have to make here, and that is I have to get trade versus scrap, versus trade versus damage. That runs a little risk there, because if you're getting trade, you have to know that you can get those cards fast enough where your opponent doesn't start just killing you with little 1 to 6 card damage cards. So there's a little bit of a risk there. So can you talk more about that, and just kind of the risk of trying to get to 7 to 8 cards? I mean, we all know that getting 7 to 8 cards is fantastic, and we want to get as many of them as we can, but there's also a risk with that.
So there's an opportunity cost there. When you buy a trade card, most trade cards, typically that's all they do. So you buy it, you put it into your deck. 1 to 2 draws later, or 1 to 2 turns later, you now have your trade card. Okay, so now I've got 6 trade, 7 trade, 8 trade. Then I play that. Then I buy my 6, 7, 8 drop. I put that into my deck. Then 2 turns later, now I draw my 6-cost card, and now I'm playing it. So the problem with cards that cost 6, 7, and 8 is that it requires you to invest a turn into buying trade to then buy the big cards. So those cards have to have catch-up potential because you're allowing your opponent to just buy cheap damage and start shooting you first. And if you don't have 6, 7, and 8 cost cards that allow you to come back or allow you to extend the game, oftentimes they're not very good.
I just wanted to mention a couple of really nice 6-card bases, you know, like the Supply Depot. I know we both love that card.
Oh yeah,
because you get to discard 2 and then get to trade for each 1 or 2 damage and then draw a card. Just a fantastic one.
It's versatile. It allows you to upgrade your Scouts and Vipers.
Yeah. Like you'll never go like I've never seen a 6 that really has had a bad effect. Like I think they are all like really solid cards if you can't get, you know, any of the 7, 8s. Frontier Station, super versatile, super amazing, you know.
Underrated, I think.
Underrated, yeah, definitely. I think it does really well early to mid game, you know, because it just gives you that versatility.
Trade, you know? The 6 outpost, ooh, that's so nice.
So like if it
and
just
it's red too,
out,
so it triggers all the ally scrap abilities that you may not.
Solid card. I love this card. This is great, you know. And then Federation Shipyard, which gives you that same effect. That allows you to top deck a ship, you know. So all solid 6s, you know. And the more 6s you have, the more evil you get.
You get 3 of them. You're the devil.
I don't know how many times, Ryan, where it's just like your opponent gets 5 and 6 cards and you're like, I'm fucked. Like, you know, just like, oh!
Forgot the granddaddy.
Hey.
The 6 drop in the game.
If I had the chance to get all 6 faces like this, and then versus that, I'm winning that one.
So,
that has...
Peacekeeper, why is that so good? 6 damage and 6 heal. That alone, fucking fantastic. But then, potentially a card draw too. Jesus Christ. That is an engine. I will buy Peacekeeper over any other 6 drop.
I would buy it over any other 6 drop.
I think it's the best 6 drop in the game. It is fan-fucking fantastic.
We're gonna make this a new term. It's gonna be called the sexy 6s, you know?
Sexy 6s. This is the sexiest of the sexiest.
This is the sexiest motherfucker of all.
This is the sinister 6. This could take down Spider-Man.
Superman will have to see. Like we'll
find out. I know.
We'll find out.
Whatever the fuck the next Spider-Man movie is called. It saves you with the 6 healing if you're getting your ass kicked. It kills a base with its 6 damage, or just hits your opponent in the face.
Well, it gives you a
swing, which is
gives you
enormous.
a 12-point advantage, basically. You know.
Yeah. If you're behind, it helps you come back. If you're ahead, it really widens the gap. You know, and potentially could be unweighted as well, which, you know, could potentially draw itself, which is, man, like so much good stuff happening in this card.
Last thing, Capital Worlds, of course.
Capital World.
You know.
Sexy Bay.
And then Emperor's Dreadnought, which is
Emperor's Dreadnought, so good.
Like our Dreadnought, like that, but you can just get in your hand right away if you have a yellow.
Yeah, the ability to put it into your hand is just,
yeah, exactly.
I
just wanted to do
so much.
You know, not much to say. I mean, there's nothing more to say about 7 or 8. They're fantastic when you can grab them early. You know.
I mean, ideally, is the time that it takes for me to get that 8-cost card worth it?
Yeah.
It may not be, especially later in the game. You may just forego the 8 drop to try to get something that draws itself or cycles or.
Yeah, like if it takes my opponent 3 turns to get that 1/8, then it might as well invest in getting all these, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards that are just gonna completely outcycle and outpace your opponent. You know.
Yeah. You might as well just get cards that shoot them in the face, like, you know.
Exactly, and then they.
You bought Capital World? Fine. Here's Blob Alpha and Ravager, and now you're dead, so it doesn't matter.
Exactly.
Guys, thank you so much for listening and watching the Dreadcutter podcast.
Thank you for scrapping your way through our podcast. We really appreciate you spending our time just chilling with our geekiness over here.
Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.